Hi, Deanna. My name is Jasminder. I want to welcome you to our Tier Youth Speaker Series. Thank you so much for being here today. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about yourself and your role as a sexual health promoter at Montage?
Absolutely. So first off, Montage Support Services supports adults with developmental disabilities, or we also refer to them as intellectual developmental disabilities. People who enter the doors are entering the doors to feel inspired and live their goals and dreams to the maximum. So Montage Support Services supports people's potential throughout their life and their time there. They provide supports in residential, person-directed planning, and community supports, along with many other great committees and groups. So they're a fantastic organization and very person-driven. My role as a sexual health promoter out of Montage Support Services is through the relationship group. And the relationship group is housed at a Montage Support Services for very obvious reasons, that person-centered driven support. I've been doing sexual health promotion for the last 20 years, specifically working with adults with intellectual developmental disabilities. And I specialize in sexual health, empowering sex esteem, providing support to individuals, groups, and organizations across the province actually around just how to support individuals and educate individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities.
When we see the rates of gender-based violence for individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities, some of those rates are higher than 80% compared to individuals that are neurotypical. Why might this be the case?
Well, there's many reasons, but one is the moment an individual is born into this world and they're diagnosed with a developmental disability, intellectual developmental disability, they're seen as being cared for, medicalized. They're not sexualized. They have no bodily autonomy, right? So they spend a lot of time with medical staff, professionals, and organizations that try to help them throughout their life. And so they become really compliant, especially if they have to be on medications and do things throughout their life. So being compliant and then not getting the education at the same time makes them incredibly vulnerable. So as they grow up, they don't grow older. So as a result, they're treated as their intellectual age, not their chronological age. And like all of us in society, we desire relationships, and we don't provide the education, the sexual education or the social education to the individuals. So that rate of abuse is there because they're incredibly vulnerable and they're not provided the skills or the knowledge to be any different other than being compliant.
I think the piece that you said about compliance is really important and a really point that we should be thinking about when we think about healthy relationships when it comes to individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities. And so I wanted to ask you, when we look at the rates of intimate partner violence, they are significantly higher, and studies also show that individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities tend to stay in those relationships for longer. Why might that be the case?
So much like the compliance piece that I spoke about earlier, sex education and healthy relationships aren't taught to individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities in the school system. And their education comes through movies or their caregivers, whether that's healthy or not. And the desire to be in a relationship of any kind is more important, and maybe not even be obvious that it's unhealthy, that they will tolerate terrible behavior and unhealthy behavior or abuse, as you say, because they don't know any different. And as a result, they're incredibly vulnerable to that abuse. And then that escalates into many different types of abuse as a result of that. It's not just emotional, it's financial, it's physical, it's sexual. It falls into all those categories because they've never been given the opportunity or taught on what is a healthy relationship. And we all need to be educated in that area, especially because they don't have access to social community. We're not talking about people that have groups of friends to go to. We're talking about individuals who see it on TV or might see it around them, but that's not the healthiest, may not be the healthiest place to learn from.
I think one of the points that you touched on around financial abuse, there are also some studies to show that individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities have higher rates of financial abuse. Can you speak a little bit to why that's the case and how we can support to help prevent that?
Yeah, financial literacy is really challenging for individuals with intellectual development disabilities, and they often need help with financials, and not because they're taught, because they're not taught. So that's the other thing, right? So they're not provided education around how to manage their finances, money management. Most people aren't. And they may not have peers. And they also might have caregivers who just do everything, because that's what you do when you take care of people you love, not recognizing that they're actually adults and not children. And on top of that, we're talking about individuals who live under the poverty line and get very little money. And any money they get is government regulated and funded. And that access to funds isn't going directly to them. It might be going to a caregiver or someone else to manage. So they may not have a clue how much they're actually getting. And so that becomes a situation where they have no concept of financial literacy and how to take care of themselves. And they're living in poverty as it is. And access to employment is nearly impossible to get out of that situation. So we've really unfortunately put them in a position where they're always going to be financially vulnerable to many people, and whether that's someone in the community they meet or someone in a relationship or a family member. We just don't have the mechanisms and the proper education for individuals to be successful in that area.
There was another form of abuse that you touched on, which was sexual abuse as well. And so would you mind speaking a little bit to the higher rates of sexual violence that individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities are facing at this time?
They just don't get sexual health education in the school system, and they don't get it at home. And knowledge is power. And if we can provide sex education to individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities at the same time as everyone else, but in plain language and in language that they can understand, we will have individuals who will feel more empowered, have more control of their bodily autonomy, and have the ability to be assertive and have some self-esteem. We're also talking about a population that's extremely bullied, right? So they will tolerate sexual assault because they don't know any different, and they don't know it's actual sexual assault. They want to be loved, they want to be in a relationship, they have no experience, so this is what they think healthy relationships is. So until they have conversations or they learn from others, this is what will happen and continue to happen until we change the way we provide support and sexual education support to these individuals.
There is this pervasive myth that individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities are childlike and dependent. And we talked about, how somebody may feel, for example, a caregiver may feel like they're helping, but then they're actually treating somebody, who's an adult like a child. And so how can these ideas actually cause harm and really contribute to the harm that's taking place when it comes to sexual violence?
I want to give a shout out to caregivers and family members and people raising individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities. They're doing the best they can. And they're dealing probably with a lot of medical behaviors and many things in life that are really complicated and hard. The challenge is separating the intellectual age with the chronological age. And what we know is when an individual turns 18, they are held to the same laws as everyone else. And that's not something that families generally understand or think a lot about. And that's not their fault. What we need to do as a society and as a school system and as organizations is provide family and caregivers with the resources and supports and tools so that they can do what they need to do, and organizations can provide that education in a timely manner, age-appropriate manner, so that when they're out and they're 18 and they're out in the community, or they're being more independent and they're being held up against the law of whatever their actions are, that there's an understanding of what a citizen has to be like when you have those basic human rights.
There's another pervasive myth that individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities don't have sexual desires. And this myth is unfortunately something that's pervasive, and it does have a negative impact. Can you speak a little bit to the negative impact that may have on things like consent education, as well as their experiences in general?
Individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities only get recognized for their sexual behaviors when it's problematic. And that's the problem, is we are all sexual beings. But because we are so focused on the medicalized problems, behaviors, medications, day-to-day life, we are not seeing them as sexual human beings that have the same desires as we all have. And then what happens is they grow up, they go through puberty, they go through life, they want the same things everyone else wants. They don't know how to access that appropriately or in a healthy way. And so it's a myth, absolutely, but people don't want to talk about it and don't want to provide them with the resources to acknowledge, because that's one extra piece of behavior and education that people just don't want to do because they're uncomfortable. And neurotypical people don't like to talk about it either. It's a huge problem in society. But our individuals with intellectual developmental disability need it more. And it's a huge issue when they're looking at pornography, or they're looking at their peers or schoolmates or movies, because that's not the greatest place to learn either, and now social media. And so it makes them incredibly vulnerable. So they have the same desires. Does it happen at the same time as anyone else? Maybe not. But over time, those things need to happen, like it needs to happen for all of us. So we need to, again, change the narrative and provide the education and support in a timely manner. And if that means providing it to the caregivers of the organizations and the staff to understand, and the individuals at the same time are separate, that's what we need to do. And that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years, is trying to empower individuals and staff to provide those resources, because it's so important, so that we all have the best quality of life.
And you touched on this several times, but I sort of want to ask it really as a summary type of question. Why is consent education and healthy relationship education so important?
Well, first of all, I think at the end of the day, neurotypical or not, it empowers us to be healthy, well-rounded, assertive, walking around with wonderful self-esteem, having control of your autonomy. All those beautiful things come with knowledge, and knowledge is power. And you become less vulnerable. And vulnerability is already an incredibly huge issue with the people who have intellectual developmental disabilities. And whether you do or not, your socioeconomic, your intellectual, your physical, there's so many barriers to life in general. And if you have education, then you're able to do better when you know more. And it's no different than the people that have intellectual developmental disabilities. So consent is complicated. It needs to be repeated, and it needs to be discussed all the time. And you can simplify it. It doesn't always have to be about sex, right? It doesn't always have to be about sexual education. It has to be in day-to-day life. And teaching those basic skills will allow people to be able to do that when they get older with confidence. And that's what that is about. So we need to embed that in our school systems. We need to support families in those conversations, and we definitely need to do that in the organizations as adults to provide them with more support.
And just to kind of close it off, we as neurotypical people, or many people as neurotypical people, have a responsibility to be more inclusive and essentially, gain a better understanding in order to provide better supports. What are some ways that people who are neurotypical can educate themselves in order to support others and be better allies?
Listen, I think ableism is harmful to everyone. And I think if we walk into every door of every building moving forward with the intention of seeing everyone as human beings, we're doing better already. Don't be intimidated. Don't be worried about the labels, the titles. People just want to be seen and heard. And you just ask and you talk to people. It doesn't take much. Being kind is also a superpower too. And I think it's important that we just take some time and be observant and ask questions and not make any assumptions. And it's challenging because we are a society that's on social media. We are on Facebook, we're all over the computers, and so is individuals with intellectual developmental disability. And social isolation is already an incredibly challenging experience for a lot of individuals. They don't typically have a lot of friends, they don't have a very big community, they don't have peers that aren't paid. And so if we can open up our communities and start having friendships and making relationships with people with different types of learning styles, and be more open to receiving those relationships, I think everyone is better off. And we have a lot to learn on both ends about how to be better people. So there's a gift in being able to see people as they truly are, and that's all anyone wants, and that's definitely no different from the people who have intellectual developmental disabilities. They want to have a voice, and they just want to be hanging out and having fun too. And that's the best quality of life, and that's the best thing we can ask for anyone.
It's a really great way for us to close off our conversation. So I just want to say thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your knowledge with us. It was incredibly powerful. And, I walked away with some new knowledge on some things that I can make more of an effort to do. And I hope that those who are tuning in are walking away with some of that same knowledge as well. So thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.